Hello, everybody. Come on in, come get settled. Happy Tuesday, wherever you are on this wondrous earth. For those who don't know me, don't remember me, or just want to hear it again, my name is Rue. I am on the experiences team at Atlas Obscura. I'm your moderator for this amazing lecture series. I'm coming to you from the East Coast, so it is very much evening where I am. Good evening, and welcome to another very exciting edition of Facts-Based World Building. We are actually, more than halfway through this session, which is mind blowing to me because wow, we are learning a lot and there's still so much to be done. That said, I know some people here might actually be tuning in for the first time, or it's been a while since you've been able to attend. So let me just run through some very quick housekeeping. Before I do that, let me give you my favorite Atlas Obscura reminder that we are here to inspire wonder and curiosity in the world around you. Exceptionally hard to do that in times like this where we're all staying home, staying apart. So that said, thank you for joining us in this virtual space and helping us navigate this virtual space as we try to bring you things that inspire that wonder and curiosity in your everyday life. And most importantly, keep you connected to the world around you and each other. Housekeeping's pretty straightforward. You've been using this Zoom link the whole time. That's not going to change. Keep on using this Zoom link. As always, this session is going to be recorded in speaker view. That is for internal purposes and also so students who are not watching live can tune in throughout the week to see what's going on today. If the idea of your face being on camera at any time, even if you're not speaking, just you don't like the idea of it, if that freaks you out, you don't want that to happen, no problem. Just toggle your video off on the bottom of the screen. It should say stop video. If you can't find it, private message me. I will help you find it. Same goes for viewing. We would love you to watch this in speaker view just so you can focus right on Moya and her amazing PowerPoint presentation. But if you'd like to, see the view of your fellow classmates or you want to just get a sense of community, you can toggle gallery view at the top of your screen at any time. We just recommend speaker view. Last but not least, please, as you always do so beautifully, keep utilizing the chat to ask questions, talk to each other, make jokes, tell us about your day, whatever it is, whatever you're doing, just be cool. We're all very cool people for being here. Everyone here is, in my experience over these last few weeks, been super respectful, very funny, so smart, so great. Just keep that up. If this becomes an unsafe or disrespectful space at any time, just know you may get booted without warning. Hasn't happened yet. Let's keep that up. I think that's all I got for you. I'm going to post the Google Classroom link for this particular class in the chat once I stop rambling. In the meantime, if you have any questions or you need any technical help, feel free to private message me, Rue, Atlas Obscura. I'm here to help. I'm going to pass it over now to Moya to teach you more about this glorious topic of facts-based world building. Thank you, Moya.
Thank you, Rue. Thank you, everyone, for joining for week 7 of Facts-Based World Building. This is the penultimate class. Next week is going to be the last lecture. We're going to end it with political science, but for today, we're focusing on the history of science and technology. I am loving your responses to what technology you couldn't live without. I really love that we're being expansive with our idea of what technology is. I saw a couple people talking about toilets and plumbing. Trevor, it looks like you said running water. Fun fact about me, grew up in a house without running water. I had a composting toilet as a child. It was a weird adolescence. So let's get into the lecture. Today we're going to have a guest lecturer, Steve Case, and I think he has a lot of really interesting and relevant things to say because of his experience with world building as an author. He's the only guest lecturer we have for the entire course who is a fiction author. So let's meet Steve.
I'm Steve Case. I am a historian of astronomy, I guess a historian of science and specialize in the history of astronomy. I specifically look at 19th century astronomy. My my book is on the history or the astronomy of Sir John Herschel, who I tell people was basically the Stephen Hawking of Victorian England. So I guess Herschel is my specialty. I teach astronomy and physics and direct a planetarium at a liberal arts college in Illinois called Olivet Nazarene University. And I also write and publish fiction.
Yeah, you do. I've read it. It's great.
Oh, thank you.
So, do you have a specialty within the history of astronomy?
So
And that was just bad editing on my part. But his work is pretty interesting. Uh, let's see, do I have anything else to add about Steve? I had to prompt him to say that he was a published fiction author. He's a very humble dude. He didn't offer that up himself. But let's get into the content of today's lecture, starting with just a definition. Again, what is technology?
I think if you ask several different historians, you would get different answers. One answer is that technology is anything that humans add to the built environment, right? So anything that is in the physical world that wouldn't be there if humans hadn't put it there. That could be understood pretty narrowly as physical artifacts, but I think it could also be understood a lot more broadly, including things like language, mathematics. I don't know if we would necessarily consider those all the time. Technology, even things like, and this has been on my mind a lot right now because I'm teaching an introductory astronomy class, calendar systems, right? Our system of measuring time. Those are all technologies that I would argue that we're embedded in, but they're not necessarily physical in the same way that a computer or, I don't know, even something like a chair would be.
Do you have any favorite examples of that stuff that we don't think of as technology, but it is?
Yeah, so I was thinking about that question in preparing for this, and one of the things that kept coming to my mind was domesticated animals. Like, is your dog a piece of technology? I mean, that's a creature that wouldn't exist in that way if we hadn't specifically bred it. We have backyard chickens, and we have 8 chickens, and 3 of them are laying right now, and those breeds do not exist naturally, right? They were bred to do the thing that they do, to give me eggs every day. So that's a form of technology. Even things like agriculture, the way that we not just the tools that we use for growing our crops, but the way that we have bred these crops over thousands of years, domesticated these grasses to become grains. I would argue those are technologies.
Yeah, what other kinds of technologies are there that we don't necessarily always think of as technology? Justin is asking, does technology have to be intentional? I would say no. There are lots of innovations, there are lots of inventions that are often accidental. So I don't think the development of technology has to be intentional. Yeah, Jackson says harnessing fire. We had to learn how to do that. So that's absolutely a technology. Any other examples you have of kind of like taken for granted pieces of technology that we have, put them in the chat. I think that there were a few questions in the Google Classroom, and when I think about the history of science and technology, I think of it as a sequence, because if you are looking at the history here on Earth, it does happen in a sequential order. But I wanted to ask Steve to use his own world building mind to tell us if that order is inevitable, if that's the way it has to be.
Well, it really depends on which part of the world you're looking at. So one of the things that I think we really need to be careful about when we talk about technology is that technology is not deterministic, in the sense that any civilization left by itself will develop X, Y, and Z in this order. I think most historians of technology would say it doesn't work that way. So for instance, you could take something that seems like, like the wheel, right? So the wheel is obviously something that needs to be invented first, so you can then have other modes of transportation. But famously, you have entire cultures, like in Mesoamerica, in South America, that they invent the wheel, but it's only ever used for like toys. It never becomes a method of transportation. You have places in the Middle East that invent the wheel and then abandon it because it's just easier to use camels with the terrain there and the distances. So to say which technologies were invented first, I think it would really depend on, like, again, where you're talking about. So things like agriculture, some of the stuff we've already mentioned, were invented in certain places and then spread. Things like calendrical systems, systems of telling time. But again, those developed very differently in very different places, depending on whether you're measuring the motion of the sun or the motion of the moon or some combination of both. So I don't know if it's necessarily that certain technologies are already developed first, but certain technologies perhaps are make their civilization more more able to spread, right, to thrive, and then those technologies are sort of carried with that civilization. Yeah, through trade, migration, people moving around, and probably conquests as well, just other cultures adopting those technologies and then adapting them for their own use. But I think, honestly, if we look at how it's developed in history, it's much more contingent. That technology is always embedded in the culture, shaped by the culture, but also by the physical world. And so personally, I think it would be very difficult to say, okay, there's the sequence where first you have stone tools, and then you develop fire, and then you develop agriculture, and then you develop metal tools, and then you develop the internal combustion engine, and then you go to the moon. I think that logic seems clear in retrospect, but I think if you actually look at the historical record, it's much, much messier and much more contingent than that.
Yeah, Michael pointed out in the chat that the environment affects what technology will happen or become important, and that is absolutely true. And that's why the development of the building of technology and science in your world comes after thinking about the environment and the history of change that your environment has had. So I like that you pointed that out, Michael. Michael also pointed out that the Dodecapus civilization doesn't have fire. So we're going to have to think about what totally different technological track the Dodecapus civilization would have, since they don't have this kind of fundamental piece of technology that we've had in our civilization. Cool. Also, remember, Steve didn't talk about this explicitly, but within a world, especially if you look at Earth's history, we divide it up into ages. So we have the Stone Age and the Iron Age and the Bronze Age, and we talk about them as if they're distinct and separate ages or eras of time. But in reality, there are people who, are mostly using stone tools at the same time as there are people in other parts of the world mostly using metal tools. So one group can be in a Bronze Age and another group at the same time can be in a Stone Age. It really just depends on what resources you have available, what your needs are, which depends on your environment and your biology. So it's all context dependent, just like culture. And that's going to be a recurring theme in this lecture, that science and technology are a part of culture. So just like it's really frustrating that culture, changes over time, and you have to understand the history to know what's happening now and what's going to come next. Science and technology are just like that.
So usually some of the classical things, obviously, like agriculture, the development of agricultural practices, because now instead of having hunter-gatherers, you can settle in one place, you can produce food in a way that's going to sustain a much larger centralized population. The development of writing, right? The development of language, which goes hand in hand with the development of agriculture. Which, interestingly enough, there's a story of, I can't remember if it was Egyptian, the idea that when writing was invented, one of the wise men, or maybe one of the Egyptian gods or something, said, "This is bad because now you will be able to forget." Right? Oh. Because now you will not have to, you will not hold this in your mind anymore. It will be on a page and you won't remember it the same way.
That God would have hated Google.
I think so. What other big ones would you put on there? Obviously you jump very far ahead. So sometimes in the Middle Ages, there's talk of sort of an early industrial revolution of harnessing things like wind and water to mill grain, right? So an early industrial revolution. Often this is talked about in terms of more and more efficient ways of harnessing power. So after wind and water, then eventually you get, again, jumping over quite a bit and simplifying quite a lot. Then you get something like the internal combustion engine, where now we can power the industrial revolution. And then probably most people would put the computer revolution on that list as well.
And you don't think it has to happen in that order?
Great.
No, I don't think it does. I think you could imagine lots of worlds where it didn't, right? Where you had just to pick one of those. If you didn't have the material culture for whatever reason to develop writing, and so you had an incredibly elaborate technology of memorization, right? Where you were trained in a different way, and you had these different practices, and there are cultures that have things similar to this, but your technology could have developed in a completely different way, so that it wasn't based on the written word in the same way that our culture is.
Okay, he's done now. I always want to jump in first. Yeah, so it's important, even though this doesn't have to be the sequence of technology development, it's important to understand how things happened here on Earth and why they happened in that way. And this is where the reading list that I have, I'm going to show that at the end of today's lecture. That's where the like extra readings will come in. But it's important to know like what happened here on Earth before you can start thinking about how things might be different under different conditions in a different environment, like on an alien planet, for example. So just remember, like, it doesn't have to be this way. In fact, I don't even really have any heuristics or rules of thumb to give you in this lecture about how science and technology develop. Mostly it's just stories and examples that Steve is going to give you based on things that he has seen and come across in his studies. So this is really just going to be a lecture in examples.
For instance, and I think this was actually an idea that you gave me, if we had a different mix of gases in our atmosphere, right? Inventing anything related to flame and ignition might become incredibly dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
But even things like, well, what if we lived on a planet that was completely overcast all the time, right? Our technologies of timekeeping would be completely different, right? Because we wouldn't have been able to see the motion of things across the sky, the cycle of objects in our sky. But not only timekeeping, navigation and surveying. So surveying as a technology, how you plot the boundaries between different land masses. If you want to know why, when you look at a map of the United States and those Western states have like such neat, perfect straight lines,
Yeah.
that's all astronomy. They're using the positions of the stars to do that survey. So if you don't have the stars, if you have a completely overcast planet, you're going to develop very different technologies, or certain technologies just aren't going to be able to be invented. If you had a planet with no magnetic field, right, you wouldn't have something like the compass. But if you had a planet with a really, really strong magnetic field, maybe our navigational technology would be even more exact, right? Maybe we would all have a highly acute sense of direction, or, I don't know, completely different instruments for orienting ourselves on the Earth's surface.
Something you said made me think of a question. You were talking about navigation technology with our magnetic field, and that reminded me of a podcast that I listened to recently that had some evidence that dogs can navigate according to the magnetic field, and birds have been shown to navigate with the magnetic field, but that's inherent, like that's a biology thing.
Has our own human evolution shaped the technology that we use? Well, I mean, like, certainly, right? The shape of my mug is because of the shape that my hand evolved in, right? So we have created our own technology to fit with our shape. I did think of an example. All right, so if we lived on a planet with no fossil fuels, right? If we had no fossil fuels on Earth, if we hadn't had this sort of the geological past that provided those for us, renewable energy would be a lot easier to develop, and I would imagine our technology, the efficiency of our solar panels or our wind turbines or whatever would be far beyond what they currently are, because if we wanted energy, we wouldn't have an easier way to get it.
I'm trying to think of a way that there could still be a climate crisis on a world fully powered by renewable sources. I wrote a story like that in college where a government had decided we need more power, so we're going to put solar panels floating in the atmosphere,
Right.
and different geographical regions will have especially designated sun access times. And it was a class warfare thing where, because people didn't have access to sunlight, there were huge rates of depression. It was
Right.
like a depression pandemic.
Whatever world your student create, they'll also find a way to break.
True. I think that's a great exercise because you have to know how to break a system to understand it really well.
I don't know. I think a lot of people can break the system without understanding it very well.
True. Yeah, but that's the other way around. I think you can break a system without understanding it, but to understand something like in all of its detail, I think you have to
Then you
also
know.
know how to break it. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
So if you want to understand your worlds, take it to the extremes. Imagine what the most extreme environments in your world are like. What's the deepest trench? What's the highest mountain? What's the coldest tundra? And what's the hottest desert? Think about the extremes, and then that'll help you understand the middle ground where honestly most of your characters or most of the people in your world are going to spend their time. So try to break your world to really understand it.
I can tell you some things that historians like to be clear did not cause these things, right? So,
my bad. Before I play this video though, there were a couple questions about, is technology created because of necessity? That's typically what people think drives technological advancement. There were some people asking questions about people in different parts of the world developing the same technology at the same time or similar technologies at the same time. And so Steve has some thoughts and explanations for how that happens.
I can tell you some things that historians like to be clear did not cause these things, right? So there's the idea that science always sort of is the catalyst for technological advance. But that can't be the case because most of the technological advances throughout most of human history came about before modern science. And then even when you get into the modern era, you have something like, just to take the example of the engine, the combustion engine, right? That was not developed because we had a good science of thermodynamics. We developed the engine and then developed the science of thermodynamics to understand how it worked. Another thing that is sometimes talked about is, well, necessity, right? We needed this thing, and so somebody had to invent it. But again, there you have lots of examples of of technological developments that were not, and we talked about the car earlier, were not seen as something that was needed. So a lot of this is really hard to pin down. Is it cultural? Is it just a specific individual who looks at the world in a different way? Although that's something that most historians are pretty uncomfortable with as well. Usually they like to point to the famous examples of, here's just an inventor who invented somebody that no one had thought of. Well, usually what happens is when you look more closely at the historical record, they're working in a tradition of development of this problem, and sort of the rest of the things that came before are kind of obscured because their development or their invention or their wrinkle on this development is so successful that we kind of forget about what came before. So I don't know. I'm not sure what the catalyst is for these different things. I think in different situations, you could point to different things.
So based on his answer of what it is probably not, it's not a lone genius inventing something in isolation. It's not always necessity. It's not that we have a new understanding of science and we apply it to a technology that we want to build. If it's not those things, then it's a combination of them or some other explanations. So it can be that we have a new understanding of science, although that's not always the case because of the combustion engine example. It can be necessity, but again, not always the case. Steve has a good example for that later in the lecture. It's not a single genius, but often it is inspiration. So science fiction and science have danced together for decades, where one will often influence the other or inspire the other. There are a lot of examples of that, like credit cards came from science fiction. Um, what else do you think could potentially drive technological advancement if you have spite? Yeah, a lot of personal things. Science is personal, which is something that I know because I am a scientist and I see all of these little interpersonal squabbles driving astronomy research in modern times. But it's hard to remember that when you look back at history. So, if you are interested in really building out the history of science and technology on your world, follow some researchers on social media who have a lot of drama, and try to trace out, how does the drama actually influence the research that gets published. There's a Twitter account right now that is devoted to talking about the drama on science Twitter, and you can see, like, if you know what drama happens, like a month later, you can see how that affects the academic research that gets published, and it's really interesting to follow that line, because that's how real science gets done, and it's how humans have done science. So just think about that. How do people react to technology? It's not uniform, but Steve has a few examples and stories to tell us. If I can get the video to play. No. Okay, 1 second.
One of the papers that we had to read in graduate school, that we were able to read, that we got to read, that was super interesting actually, was talking about exactly this, the adoption of cars, and how one of the things that people did when they bought their cars, when they got a car on the farm, they said, well, basically it's an engine hooked up to wheels. So let's just drive it out into the field and hook a crank to it and use it to pump water or to, do whatever labor we would normally use an engine to do. And industrialists and the people that were manufacturing these were like, no. Okay, that'll be a tractor. Like, we'll create something, but what you need to do with cars is drive them on roads. And the fact is, when they were invented first, and then the need had to be like created for them through marketing and through basically being convinced that you need this thing. And then once that takes off, then the infrastructure is created that then makes it seem inevitable. I would say a lot of places where you see resistance to technology in history, it's because it's seen as a threat to certain values, right? So in England, when the Industrial Revolution is taking off, right, people are resisting and breaking the spinning machines and the technologies that are creating all of these new textile industries, because they're seeing their livelihoods destroyed, right? They're seeing so there it's a resistance to technology, but it's because the values that technology carries are seen to be threatening to this particular way of life. Oftentimes, resistance is seen as hopelessly outdated and old-fashioned, right? And that the new technology is going to be better in every way and just like supersede the old. So the example in this particular study was looking at, I believe it was just after World War I, on airplane technology. And it was wooden technology, airplanes using wood and glue and everything that would be involved, like fancy glues, but like how you would build a composite wing out of wood versus metal aircraft. And retrospectively, metal won out because metal is so much better. But if you look at that moment, technologically, they performed the same. Like there were costs and benefits to both, and there was really no way to objectively say a metal aircraft was better than a wooden aircraft. But the perception was such that metal was high tech, metal was the way to go, and so the funding was cut off for the studies of the wooden airplanes.
Lots of branding probably went into that.
I'm sure there was a lot of money tied up into it somewhere.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there was a lot of lobbying. There was another example I was reading about. It was the Sony Walkman, the tape recorder, right? When the tape recorder was first invented, like they figured out how to do this, but then it was a question of who wants this, Like, what, we have this thing. And so they were trying to sell it to schools as a learning instrument, and to like courtrooms so they could record like court proceedings. And it wasn't until people realized, oh, well, we could record music and this would be fun, that it really took off. So again, the technology sort of preceded the need, or the need for the technology to be manufactured. I'm talking about like Edison versus Tesla. Who's the better salesman, right? Who can promote this technology better? From what I understand, and I haven't looked at that particular episode very closely, but from what I understand, Edison spent a lot of time trying to convince people that the other way of getting energy out was much more dangerous, which wasn't necessarily the case. But when you're talking about technologies that are going to be integrated into infrastructure, then you have a whole nother layer of, okay, well, who do you know in government that's actually going to get this up and running and show that it works in this particular city, or who's going to pass the zoning laws, who's going to. So then it gets very complex, because it's not just I have a better, more efficient way of doing this, but I know the right people that are going to put this into place.
Yeah, unfortunately, even in the false meritocracy that is science, it's all about who you know. If you're an inventor and you're trying to get other people to actually use your invention. So who do you know? How much money do you have? How charming are you? How much do people like you? All of this will determine what technology actually gets adopted and spread throughout societies, unfortunately. Technology presumably has some limits. At least the technology we have here on Earth can't do everything, and so we're going to talk about like the theoretical limits of technology. But when you are building your worlds, it's important to think about the actual limits of technology that exist at the time. So if you're writing a story set in a world, then think about when the story takes place and what access to technology they have at that time. So like temporally, technology is limited, even if it theoretically doesn't have any limits.
I think most people would agree that technology has, in the past 200 years, advanced at an accelerating rate. And whether that is driven by economies, right? Growing population, growing trade, and also growing scientific advancements. Probably a little bit of all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to me, it seems like there are a lot of like convergent technologies that, because they exist at the same time, make it easier for that rate of advancement to increase. Like the fact that we can travel around the world and we have the ability to communicate with people means that ideas can spread more quickly and we can advance faster. But all of those things have to be in place at the same time.
Right.
Does that make sense?
I think so. So if you understand technology as culture, as cultural expression, then to me it seems like as long as there is human culture, we will be manipulating and adjusting and developing our built environment. Mm-hmm. If you're talking about specific types of technology, like, well, what about plastic and fossil fuel based technology? Is that a bubble waiting to burst? Well, if that technology is contingent on a limited physical resource, then yes, I would say probably. But technology more broadly understood, as long as there is thriving human culture, I would hope that there is technology.
And I feel like when people talk about this topic, they usually bring up a Dyson sphere.
Okay.
Which I don't super love, because there are other ways to get energy than just solar energy. So it's not like we're limited.
Well, and I think it also reduces technology to purely more effective harnessing of energy. Mm-hmm. And to me, that seems a very deterministic and a very reductionist view of technology. If technology is culture, and then things like, I don't know, ways of creating art more effectively, or ways of, I don't know if you can create art more effectively, but right, there's all of these other things that technology can do for us other than just capture energy for us. Mm-hmm. So I agree. That seems kind of reductionist to me.
I hope you don't have strong opinions on Dyson spheres, because Steve and I apparently do. Let's see. Yeah, if you have any other questions about what we're saying here, please put them in the chat. Justin just asked, in a fantasy setting, can this stuff be translated into things like magic systems? Yes, I have a slide about magic systems later on in this lecture. Right. So we covered technology, but let's move on over to science, which is closely related, but is not necessarily the same thing.
So do the sciences develop in any particular order? Well, they did. But again, is there any reason they necessarily had to, right? And I think I would say probably not. I think I would be wishy-washy and say science is part of culture as well. And you could imagine a world where astronomy never develops, because like we were talking about earlier, if you have a world that doesn't even have to be overcast all the time, maybe has multiple suns, so there's always a sun in the sky. So you have here on Earth, you had the development of astronomy. You had a lot of time spent trying to understand the physical patterns of the sky. And then you had the development of mathematics along with that, trying to fit those into mathematical systems. And then you had just this whole messy efflorescence of lots of other things being developed in different directions at different times. You have something like thermodynamics that comes along a lot later that is, again, specifically because a new technology has been invented, a technology that's central to this industrial complex that's being developed. So if you don't have fossil fuels, do you ever get the science of thermodynamics? Do you even need it in the same way? Yeah, which is, again, just a fancy way of saying, I don't think there is a specific way that the sciences have to develop. So when we study scientific theories, we want to understand how is that understood in its own time and context? Was it reasonable then based on the evidence that they had based on their own worldview? So one of the things I do when I teach astronomy is we talk about the geocentric cosmology. And I feel like I'm like hitting the students over the head with, a spherical, unmoving world at the center of the universe was not believed for thousands of years because people were stupid, or because they were superstitious, or because the Bible told them that's how it was, or the church told them that's how it was, but because that made physical sense. Like it fit observation and it fit the understanding that we had of physics. And talking about a planet spinning through space and like going around the star, that doesn't make any sense at all, because that doesn't, we don't feel that, we don't see that. That's really hard to convince someone of. So an understanding of these scientific theories in their own terms as they were understood then, which again, I think could often come up in fiction, where you have maybe not necessarily different worlds at different technological levels, but different worlds with different scientific frameworks, right? Different ways of viewing the universe. So I guess when I say a science, so those are some of the assumptions in our scientific framework, that nature is going to behave law-like, that mathematics, for whatever reason, is going to be a really, really good framework for interpreting our observations. That matter is going to be more or less inert, right? That we're going to, at least in the Newtonian view, which maybe we can question a little bit now. So those are some of the frameworks of modern science. Could you imagine a science that didn't have those frameworks, but that still was doing useful things in the world? Well, now we can kind of talk about technology. Could you imagine alternate technologies where other civilizations outside of the Western experience were thriving, and were doing really well with understanding their own context and their own world?
Yeah. I mean, the first example that comes to my mind is Polynesian wayfarers.
Sure, right.
How, like, they were able to navigate the open seas before anyone else thought it was possible.
Right. So they clearly had technology. They clearly had knowledge. Would we say they had scientific knowledge in the same way because they didn't actually understand what the stars were and like what they were doing? Is that fair? the more careful historical approach would be, but let's evaluate what they were doing in terms of that particular context.
So we Steve didn't talk about this either, but the way I think of it here on Earth, the different frameworks that humans have had historically is that we started with myths. And by framework, what I mean is the set of principles or the fundamental truths that you use to explain the world around you. And so that can happen through myths. You can explain the world around you using gods or supernatural beings who have the power to manipulate the world around you. You can, so we started with that. And then we moved to philosophy, which was, kind of a hybrid between myths and the modern scientific method. And then we move to science the way we see it now. And you can see this progression. There's evidence of this progression in the fact that scientists in the 16th, 17th, even 18th centuries were more likely than scientists today to describe themselves as religious. Newton, for example, was a religious person, but was also a mathematician and a physicist, and by some accounts, believed that God was a mathematician who used math to create the universe. And so if you could understand math and science the way that we use it now, then you could better understand the universe and therefore also better understand God. And so I want to encourage you to think outside the box when it comes to scientific frameworks or like mental frameworks that can exist on your worlds. And I really want you to sit with the idea that Steve said, that people don't have the frameworks they do because they're stupid. He said the geocentric model of the universe didn't exist for thousands of years because people were stupid, and that's true. So when you're developing the science and technology on your world, try and do the exercise of forgetting everything you know about how our universe works. Forget the scientific framework that most of the modern world uses these days, and instead forget it all and just look at or think about what information is available to people on your world, and then come up with a framework that best explains the information you have access to, because that's how it works in real time. People look at the world around them, they collect information, and they come up with an explanation that works with that info, that works with that data. And so just remember, like, people in your world aren't stupid, even if they don't have the same science and technology that we do. So moving on from science and technology to magic, because I think the two are connected with this one idea from Arthur C. Clarke. His third law was that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, meaning if you have technology that is so advanced that people can't understand how it works, that's essentially the same thing as having magic that people don't understand how it works. Both of them get things done without other people necessarily being able to explain why. Dan asks, what do I think science fiction is? There are modern myths to explain things we don't understand yet. Science fiction can be that. Science fiction, I saw someone say on the internet recently that science fiction explores what is possible, given our current technology and given the trajectory that we think our technology will take. And fantasy, on the other hand, describes or explores what is impossible, given our current technological path. You can have a world that has technology and magic. You have to, right? If fire is technology, and if magic is, or if writing is technology, or math is technology, then yeah, you're going to have a world that has both magic and technology in it. So just be cognizant of where the boundaries between those lie, or if you want to try and create a world where the boundary between those things is fuzzy, just be intentional about that. Right. So if you want to build a magic system, well, first of all, you should do it at the beginning. A magic system, the presence of magic in your world is one of those things that would make your world different. Meaning, if you go back to the steps that I outlined for fictional world building, the first step is asking yourself what makes your world different, and magic would be an appropriate answer to that question. So if you're going to build a magic system, do it before this. But if you're going to do that, the first thing to think about is what the tone of your magic system, of your magic world is going to be. This can exist along multiple axes, right? Like you can imagine a world that's mostly dominated by dark magic or light magic. If you play Magic the Gathering, then you can think of the different colors, the color system, and try to figure things out using that tone, that magic system. Yeah, you can midichlorians. Is that what they're called? I've never seen Star Wars. But yeah, you can use that. I know, it's shocking.
They are midi-chlorians, Moya.
Midichlorians.
Midi-chlorians.
Sorry. Sorry. I'll turn in my my fiction writer's card after this class is over. Yeah, so figure out what the tone of your fantasy world is. Is it high fantasy? Is it low fantasy? Whatever you want. I think this link will take you to something that specifically focuses on high versus low fantasy. And then think about if you want to have a hard or soft magic system. This distinction, this spectrum between soft and hard magic, I think was originally developed by Sanderson. So the difference between the two is that, if you're not familiar with the spectrum, is that hard magic has rules, and the rules are clearly defined. It's almost like a science in a way. A hard magic system can be explained the same way that electromagnetism can be explained. It has rules that need to be followed. And once you know those rules, you totally understand what the bounds of that magic system are. Soft magic, on the other hand, is more like mysticism. It's not necessarily explained. It doesn't have hard rules that you have to follow. And this is a spectrum, so it doesn't have to be like hard or soft. It can be somewhere in between. Yeah, if you have examples of hard or soft magic systems that you've seen in movies or read in books or whatever, put that in the chat. Mistborn is a hard magic system. Yeah, for sure. Gandalf is a soft magic system. Yeah, Tolkien's world, Middle Earth, has a soft magic system there. No matter which type of system you choose, or what no matter what tone you want to set for your magic system or your fantasy world, there are some things that you should know if you want to totally understand your magic system. And if you're going to write a fantasy thing or create a fantasy story or a fantasy world, then yeah, you absolutely should understand how magic in that world works. So think about the provenance of the magic. Where does it come from? Does it come from gods who gifted it to humans? Is it a skill that humans can learn and teach to other humans? Is it something that's almost biological? Is it something that gets passed down through families? So figure out where the magic comes from. Figure out who can use it, figure out what the limitations of your magic system are. Can your magic just conjure any item out of nothing? If it can do that, does it exact some sort of toll? Is there a price for your magic, in other words? And then how do magic wielders behave? By which I mean a bunch of different questions, like think about The Magicians, which is a book series and also a TV series. But in The Magicians, the rest of the world doesn't know that magicians exist. It's a secret group. And so that means that the magicians in that universe behave very differently from magicians in the Kingkiller Chronicles, for example, where everyone knows that there's this magic university that you can go to. Also, anyone can learn to use magic. But not everyone does. And so think about how your magic wielders behave. But generally speaking, magic is to fantasy as technology is to sci-fi, by which I mean they're not afterthoughts. If you're going to make a fantasy world, then magic is fundamental to your fantasy world. It affects everything. Except for special cases where most of the people in that world don't know that magic exists. But even in that case, like even in The Magicians, they talk about how there are spells that affect the rest of the world, the mundane or muggle world. So magic is fundamental to that story, just like in sci-fi, technology is fundamental to the story. So you have to incorporate it from the beginning. When you are constructing the history of science and technology on your world, and maybe some of these will also apply to constructing a magic system, here are some things that you should think about. So think about the frameworks that people have. Maybe people in different parts of the world have different frameworks, and that is cause for some conflict. Think about the limits between technology and magic. So what are some things that we use technology to do that in a fantasy world they might use magic to do? I remember reading Sarah Maas's A Court of Mist and Fury, which is the second book in her Court of Thorns and Roses trilogy. And there's this scene where two characters they're almost texting, like they're sending messages instantaneously back and forth between each other, but they're using magic to do it because one of the people involved has the ability to like send and conjure this little piece of paper that they're writing on at will. It's like, it looks like texting. So think about the limits between magic and technology. I said this before, but what technology do you want your life forms on your world to have access to at any given moment? How do technology and conflict interact on your world? Does technology make things easier? I'm sure it does in some ways, but it probably also makes other things more difficult. And how do people react? Think back to some of the examples that Steve gave about how people have reacted to different technology on Earth's history. And what industries or groups drive technology? Here on Earth, when a new piece of technology is developed, who is typically inventing it, or which industries are typically adopting it and using it and making it more popular or common? Like who's the Steve Jobs? Who's the Jeff Bezos of your world? Also, what is the military of your world, right? Like on Earth, the military is often responsible for adopting technology early and then making it like cheap for other people to use afterwards. Some reading that I think you should have. Most of these are thin. The thickest one is this thick. Okay, so they're some small books. The first is very appropriately called A Little History of Science. I have not yet had the chance to read this. It has been on my bedside table for 2 months, but I very much look forward to reading it, and it is well reviewed. The second book I have read. This is the first nonfiction book I have ever enjoyed. I read it 2 years ago. Before that, I only read fiction books. It talks about different big inventions that changed the course of human history, like glass or cold. So it's pretty interesting. Bill Bryson's At Home is actually the book that I am working my way through right now. I just started it a couple days ago, and it talks about different inventions in your home that you might not necessarily have thought of the history of. So like the history of stairs. The beginning is talking about, what is the beginning talking about? Never mind. Oh, it was talking a lot about clergymen in like 16th century England, or like, that moment in England. Anyway, I got carried away. So this book is called Figuring. It's the thickest book in the bunch, and it talks about the history and the stories of different women and queer scientists throughout Earth's history. These two books, The Story of Music and Devil in the White City, I included because they talk about the history of two different things that I wish I could cover in this class, but I couldn't. We've had a lot of questions about music that I just haven't been able to answer. And so here is a book that will tell you about the history of how music was developed here on Earth. It's actually a really cool story. And The Devil in the White City, it's about a serial killer, but it's also about architecture and the ways that architecture had to be innovated when building in Chicago because of the crappy like foundation, the crappy soil that Chicago has. And then here are two books that talk about like what are the consequences of technology. The Death of Expertise. I haven't read either of these. I'll put that out there. But both of them talk about, well, The Death of Expertise talks about, you know, now that we have the ability for anyone to look something up on the internet, what does that mean for the way that knowledge has traditionally been like held by a small group of people, and now it's held by a much larger group of people. And Dataclysm, you know, with technology, at least on our technology path, that means producing a lot of data and information. And here is a book that can tell you about the different types of data that are available and what people do with it. Yeah, those are my recommendations. Next time we're going to talk about political science. It's going to be really cool. We have an awesome guest lecturer. But before then, try to imagine a groundbreaking piece of technology on our world. Remember, we have 3 different species. We've already talked about how the Dodecapus will have an interesting technological path because they can't have fire underwater. I did do an ExoLore episode, I think it's 2, the world of, there are lots of moons, the world of giant mud puppies, it might be called, that talks about technology development underwater. So that might be interesting to check out. I haven't done anything with our vulture people yet. Let's imagine in 4 minutes, I'm so bad at time management, I'm sorry. Let's imagine what technology these vulture people would have. So they're birds, so let's assume they have the ability to navigate with the magnetic field that exists on our planet. We never explicitly said what our magnetic field was like, so let's assume it's similar to Earth's. Oh, Justin, a way to measure wind. So yeah, let's assume that early on, or like one of their biggest technological advancements is a way to measure the speed and direction of wind. Thinking about their maps, I think that they would have these beautiful, actually, I don't want to say anything about how they would look, but I think that they would have maps that map out air currents. That would be important for them. But maybe they don't have the ability to write. So how would they share information? Birds makes me think about, oh yeah, ocean current maps, that's also important. Birds make me think about singing, and there have been a lot of examples of people using song to like spread information. You remember this book about Genghis Khan? They also used songs to make sure everyone knew, like, this is how we're going to go into battle, and this is how we will transport our tools and stuff. So yeah, I think singing will be big for the birds. Other big technological advancements that would make it just like really kind of make the vulture creatures civilization boom. Well, they live on these tiny little islands. So I think having a way to communicate across the islands would be huge. And since they mostly communicate with songs, I don't know, maybe building structures on the tops of these different island mountains that like are tuned into the frequency that the birds use to sing, and so maybe like they can communicate long distance that way. That's what I'm thinking. So try to do something like that, but better than I did. And imagine a piece of technology that would really help one of these 3 dominant species grow in size and importance on this world. Any literally last minute questions? Cool. All right. Well, then I will see you all next week for the last class of the course.
Oh my. Well, in the meantime, I hope you guys have a fabulous Thanksgiving or whatever you're celebrating this weekend. I hope it's safe. I hope it's cozy. I hope it's happy. We will see you next week. Same Zoom link, same bat time, same bat channel. Any questions, feel free to reach out to Moya herself. Utilize Google Classroom or email experiences@atlasobscura.com. All right, guys, take care. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Bye bye.
Bye, everyone.